Okay, so my name is Bas. That's how the Dutch shorten Sebastian. So if you're more comfortable calling me Sebastian, that is also fine. It sometimes sounds a bit weird to people from other countries. So I want to talk to you today about the masters and their letters, and specifically about how we can approach all those materials, the testimony, the letters themselves, within an academic context. So my objective is to find a suitable way to approach the masters and their letters within an academic context. So what does that mean? Well, basically it means that I will be adopting something like a scientific approach. So what do I mean by that? I mean that I'm looking for a methodology which is empirical, which is evidence-based, which involves systematic observation, which involves logical inferences based on empirical evidence. So what I will be focusing on, it's an often heard complaint that academic research can be a bit slow. But it's slow because it's thorough, because you have to prove every step that you make. So what I want to do today is create solid foundations for how we can approach the masters and their letters. So this talk won't end with me telling you who wrote the Mahatma letters. That is many years ahead. But I do want to explain how I think we could approach these letters. So I will start by reviewing some of the recent scholarship, mainly academic publications of the last 20 years. What we will see is that we made enormous strides with the genealogy, if you will, of the myth of the masters. We know much more now where the idea of masters could have come from. But what has been neglected is the historical reality of the masters. Now, one person who did address that issue was K. Paul Johnson. And there's a lot we could say about his work, and I will say something about it now. But what I mainly want to focus on today is the sort of problems you encounter when you apply a historical approach to these materials, to the testimony about the masters and the letters themselves. Now, these were problems that Johnson encountered in his work. And because these problems were there, and they were there in the material, he really, in some ways, struggled. And we could be very critical of what he did, and I'm not going to do that today, because I think he did excellent work. But I think part of the problems with his work is the material itself, and I will analyze that. And then finally, I will make some suggestions on what we can do to overcome these obstacles, these pitfalls. So first of all, I want to mention a forthcoming publication. I've been assured by Tim that this could be out as soon as November. Potentially, it could still take till March next year. But this important book contains a very important article which was written by Jocelyn Godwin. And it's based on a paper he delivered a few years ago at an S-Way conference.
What conference?
Sorry?
What, I didn't hear you. What?
An S-Way conference.
What's that?
It's written there. It's the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism. Now, I won't have a lot of time today to go into the who, what, where, when of the Mahatma letters. And if you're interested in that, this would be a good place to start your research. What is also significant about this publication is that Godwin doesn't shy away from the difficult questions. He also discusses authorship. And that makes this a very significant publication. Godwin kindly shared his paper with me, so I could consider it for my own paper today. But I just want to mention this, because this shows that maybe something is changing with regards to the academic study of the masters and their letters. And I hope to be part of the same change. For all intents and purposes, we could say that the academic study of the masters and their letters began at the start of the new millennium in 2002, when Brandon James French published his dissertation, The Theosophical Masters. He worked on his dissertation at the University of Sydney. Now, French, in a way, establishes some basic trends that are very common in the 10 years or so of scholarship after that. So I have a quote from him that I will read, and then I will highlight some aspects of it. So French says that, as with all claims to meta-empirical insight, the scholarly tools do not exist to prove or to disprove Blavatsky's or Leadbeater's assertion of contact with masters. Nevertheless, what little attention the masters have received from scholars has been developed upon this very question. Do they exist as verifiable historical entities? The focus of the present work concentrates rather on the function of the masters in theosophical discourse, and on what aspects of esotericism and modernism they might incarnate for the faithful. Now, there's a few things I want to highlight here. First of all, apparently French conceives of the masters as, to some degree, metaphysical entities. Entities that are not observable and that, as scholars, we cannot verify the existence of. So he sees them as a construct, as a myth. And what he's interested in is, how does this myth function within theosophical discourse? What sort of a role does it have in theosophical thought? He's also interested in what aspects of esotericism it incarnates for the faithful. So what he means by that is, how is this idea of the masters expressive of what we know about esotericism? Now, French's work is then picked up by Wouter Hanegraaff in his entry on intermediary beings for the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. Hanegraaff writes that a typical development in modern theosophy is the idea that members of the occult hierarchy, and especially in this case of the Great White Brotherhood, that supervise spiritual evolution on our earth, might actually be living in our own world. Precedents to the notion of masters can be found in the unknown superiors, of the high degree masonry of the strict observance, which may in turn be inspired by the Rosicrucian notion of a hidden brotherhood. Now, in this text, Wouter also cites French, but what I want to highlight here is that now the masters become part of this history of intermediary beings. The founder of the academic field of Western esotericism, Antoine Febvre, who was already mentioned today, believed that esotericism could be described by 4 essential characteristics and 2 non-essential characteristics. Now, one of these characteristics was imagination and mediation. So it was basically the idea that we live in a multi-layered universe where a great chain of beings stretches from the lowliest existence to the ultimate. Now, in this layered universe, there are beings which inhabit intermediary layers. And these beings, angels would be an obvious example, they mediate. They mediate the divine for human beings. They transmit knowledge, they grant wishes, they can be invoked sometimes in magical ceremonies, in certain currents within esotericism. So what Hanegraaff is doing here, he is placing the masters in this longer history of intermediary beings, which is a very common phenomena in the history of esotericism. And they become, so to speak, the latest edition of this basic esoteric idea. Now, this is then picked up by Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who writes in The Coming of the Masters that Blavatsky constructed the masters as revealers of the ancient wisdom on the model of adepts or brothers. According to Western esoteric traditions of Rosicrucianism, high-grade Freemasonry, and even modern spiritualism, the Oriental identity and location of the Theosophical masters was a later development, motivated by Orientalism and the Theosophist move to India. So again, you see that the masters are treated as a construct. And what's new here is that Goodrick Clark is focusing more on this turn towards the East, the way that Orientalist and Oriental influences influence this idea. Now, this article was published in a collected volume entitled Constructing Tradition, which was edited by Andreas Kilger, and it was followed by an article by Tim, entitled Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's Esoteric Tradition. Tim writes that Blavatsky's construction of tradition was separated into an esoteric and an exoteric tradition. The esoteric tradition consisted of universal truths, whereas the exoteric traditions primarily consisted of human interpretations of the universal elements structured into dogmas and rituals, which would inevitably change and alter with time. The particular narrative function of Blavatsky's masters in relation to the two traditions is to function as intermediaries between the timeless truth and the historical exoteric traditions. Now, this article is quite sophisticated, and that's mainly because Tim actually does a very close reading of certain key theosophical texts. But at the same time, we can see some of the same trends in this passage that we've already noted before. So again, there is an interest in the particular narrative function of this idea, not so much in the masters themselves, but the idea that the Theosophists had about the masters and how this functions in the broader discourse of Theosophy. Now, we also see something else happening. So these are two recent monographs. Julie Shias' just published book, The Recycled Lives, about reincarnation, and Tim Roetbroek's dissertation, which is still being developed into a book.
Which book is that Recycled Lives you wrote that?
Julie wrote it. She's sitting there. So I would seek her out if you're interested in it. But both these books sometimes mention the Mahatma letters. They cite or they reference the Mahatma letters. And when they do so, they use the traditional authorship attributions. So they might refer to a letter written by Kutumi or a letter written by Moria. Now, of course, these books aren't designed to deal with the question of who wrote the Mahatma letters, so I would consider that an acceptable practice. But what is happening here is that the Mahatma letters are treated as documents that are significant to early theosophy, that show the development of theosophical thought and that emerged from a circle of theosophists. What is striking to me is that there's not really an attempt to link this to what I just discussed, this genealogy of the myth. So there's a certain degree of disconnect here. So on the one hand, you have the masters as a metaphysical construct with roots in Western esotericism. On the other hand, you have the Mahatma letters as evidence of early theosophy. And these are two separate ideas within academia in the last 15 years or so. Now, I think there's several problems here, and one of the problems is that this is very much based on a Favrean conception of what esotericism means. Now, the field has been slowly moving away from this particular conception of esotericism, and some scholars, including me, might say that it's a little bit outdated now. And it's very prominent in this kind of philosophizing about intermediary beings. So that's one problem. Another problem is that when you discuss the Mahatma letters, authorship is important. There's no two ways about it. If there's a difference, for example, between something that is written in the Mahatma letters and something that is written in the Secret Doctrine, there's two ways to explain it. You could say, well, if Blavatsky, wrote the Mahatma letters, you could say maybe she changed her mind. But if Blavatsky did not write the Mahatma letters and they are expressive of another authentic voice on early theosophy, then you might actually be dealing with a difference of opinion. So we cannot just, well, we can for the moment bracket authorship, but in the end we'll have to discuss it and we have to deal with that. Finally, and perhaps most essentially, I'm not sure if we should treat the Mahatmas as metaphysical. If you read testimony about meetings with the masters, and I will discuss that in a moment, about 90% of it is pretty mundane. These figures are described as normal human beings who talk and act and can be touched and so forth. Of course, there's supernatural elements there, but they are not the whole story. There's also quite a strong historical claim. So to kind of say, well, we should just remain agnostic about the existence of the masters because they're not observable entities, that doesn't sit right with me. So where did this idea originate, that the masters are agnostic and that they are not accessible to scholarly inquiry. Well, an article that French cites, and which is very important in the field of Western esotericism, is an article by Wouter Hanegraaff called The Empirical Method in the Study of Esotericism, which he wrote in 1995, and which is sort of his manifesto.
Where did he publish it?
Sorry?
Where did he publish it?
I think it was in Methods and Theories of the Study of Religion. So this is kind of his methodological manifesto for the study of Western esotericism. And in it, he makes a distinction between emic perspectives and ethics perspectives. Now, this goes back to a theory developed by Jan G. Platvoet, who was a Dutch scholar of religion. And he basically said that believers embrace an emic perspective, which involves a multiple tier cosmology. So what that means is that there's empirical levels of reality and there's non-empirical levels of reality. Now, scholars, on the other hand, only recognize the empirical level of reality. They only recognize what they can see and what they can observe and what they can prove. Now, ideally, scholars would remain agnostic with regards to these higher levels of reality, which are simply outside of the purview of scholarly study. Now, the question then is where do we position the masters and their letters? And the answer that French gave was that we should position them on these meta-empirical levels of reality. But I'm not sure that is the right way to go, because the way they are described, they are not just entities which exist in a far-off metaphysical realm. They have a very real physical existence in the way they're described in the Theosophical sources. But there's, of course, a problem, and that is these supernatural elements that occur in descriptions of meetings with them. So perhaps the scheme that Platvoet and Hanegraaff use is not so sophisticated, because, of course, the meta-empirical doesn't stay meta-empirical. If the meta-empirical would not affect us, if God would not answer our prayers, then there would be no point for a religious person to believe in a God. So what is missing from this scheme a little bit is the interactions, the mixtures, the moments where the meta-empirical manifests on the empirical plane. And of course, when it manifests in the form of a supernatural event or a miracle, that's something observable, at least in theory. Now, Jung says, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, and I think that is the approach we should take as scholars. Now, as historians, we deal in probabilities. We can never be sure that something truly happened. We have a number of sources, and we try to come up with a likely interpretation of those sources. We never know anything for sure. Now, when we do this, we balance two things, according to Jung. On the one hand, we have the credibility of fact, which is simply how likely is something in general. It's not very likely that I will win the lottery, but it's possible. It's much more likely that I will have dinner tonight. You see, there's a difference there, and it's something you have to consider. Now, we always have to balance this with the authority of testimony. Even though it's not very likely that I will win the lottery, we can all imagine evidence that will convince us beyond a shadow of a doubt that I won the lottery. You might see me on TV accepting a big check, or you might see me driving my new Ferrari. There is an evidence strong enough to convince you that I won the lottery, even though winning the lottery in general is not very likely. Now, on the other hand, if I told you I had dinner last night, you don't require very strong proof for that, because it's a very common, mundane thing. The evidence doesn't have to be very strong. Now, when you look at miracles or paranormal events or supernatural happenings, there's a problem with this form of reasoning. Because from a scholarly perspective, we would say that paranormal events do not happen. It's not like winning the lottery. Sometimes people win the lottery, but supernatural events don't happen at all. I'm purely speaking from a very secular, scholarly perspective. Of course, But there was widespread interest in these phenomena starting in the 19th century, and we could not reproduce them inside a laboratory, within experimental settings. So basically, from a scholarly perspective, we don't have a single convincing case of something supernatural occurring. Now, if you don't have a single convincing case, that means that the credibility effect is basically zero in this equation. Now, if the credibility effect is zero, then the authority of testimony would have to be infinite, which is impossible. And evidence can never be absolute, because we only deal in probabilities. So, based on this line of reasoning, Hume concluded that the plain consequence is, and it is a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehoods would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. So, this is why within an historical approach we cannot accept evidence of miracles. So just to sum up, miracles are said to occur in the empirical realm. In other words, miracles occur in the realm that scholarship concerns itself with. As historians, we do not believe that testimony of miracles is plausible. To provide testimony of a miracle is to make a historical claim. But it is a historical claim that we reject. Of course, you can claim that Jesus died and that 3 days later he was alive again, and that in principle would be observable. But since we have not a single case of that occurring, it is the most unlikely thing imaginable. I won't go as far as to say it is completely impossible, because as a historian I cannot determine that. That would be up to my colleagues in the natural sciences. But nonetheless, what this means is that we are not agnostic with regards to miracles. We don't just say, well, I'm not sure if Jesus rose from the dead on the third day. No, actually, as an historian, you can engage with that claim. That is not just a metaphysical claim. It's also an historical claim, an unlikely one, but nonetheless. Now, how is this relevant? Because I can imagine it seemed like a pretty long digression, but when you look at testimony about the masters, and Daniel Caldwell has done an amazing job to collect all this testimony in one place on his website, blavatskyarchives.com, which I highly recommend looking at. Now, if you look at these testimonies, there's often elements there that, as historians, you simply cannot accept. And I'm thinking of things like apparitions, masters that suddenly appear, material miracles, materializations, clairvoyance, recognition and precognition, so the ability to see in the future and to see into the past, mind reading. Now, because all these elements are present in the testimony, what do we do with them? You know, do we simply eliminate them? Do we simply subtract them? Can we believe what is left when we do that? That's a problem that historians face. Now, what I would argue is that K. Paul Johnson, in his famous book, The Masters Revealed, which was published in 1994, was acutely aware of these methodological issues. And you can see that from the following quote. Because their spiritual status and psychic powers are inaccessible to historical research, these alleged criteria of Mahatmaship are treated with agnosticism. The Mahatmas are historical figures who helped prepare H.P. Blavatsky for a mission as spiritual teacher and are sponsored the Theosophical Society from behind the scenes. So what I want to highlight here is Johnson's use of the term agnosticism. Now, while I would admit that spiritual status is not observable, psychic powers to some degree are, because they produce observable effects. So I again would say that this is not a fully correct use of methodological agnosticism, or epichy, as James Santucci called it this morning. But still, this is getting closer to what I have in mind. Now, there's a lot that I could say about this book, but I want to highlight kind of one of the main pitfalls that I think Johnson often falls into. And this is what is called the subtraction method. So this term derives from higher criticism, from the Bible criticism that was common in the 19th century. So what do we do when we're confronted with sources that contain both supernatural and natural elements? Is that we could subtract the supernatural elements and conclude that what remains represents the core of truth. So you're faced with an account which is mixed. It contains supernatural elements, but it also contains elements that could very well be true. So for example, in the Bible, in the book Joshua, there's a battle between the Israelites and the Canaanites. Now, during this battle, the prophet Joshua stops the sun in the sky to allow the fighting to continue. Now, you could simply say, that's not very likely that he stopped the sun in the sky, but possibly there was a battle between the Israelites and the Canaanites. So subsequently, we can use this core of truth to identify other sources that talk about the same events. So I'm just making this up, but maybe we find some archaeological evidence that suggests that there was a battle between the Canaanites and the Israelites. Or maybe we find an hitherto unknown Egyptian source which mentions a battle between the Canaanites and the Israelites. And then we could conclude, hey, this is Joshua's battle. This is the battle where Joshua supposedly stopped the sun, but we assume that that's not very likely. Now finally, we can then triangulate both the original account and the independent sources to reveal the underlying historical reality. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that any similarity, any match between two historical accounts at this point could be purely accidental. You see, we have an original account which contains supernatural elements and natural elements. Now, the supernatural elements don't seem credible. But out of all the credible elements that are left in the account, we have no way of determining which are true. We already know that the text doesn't contain only truth or only likely things because we have the supernatural elements. So this line of thinking is based on quicksand, on intuition, on sophistry ultimately. So one place where you see that in Johnson's book is when he discusses Moria. Now in the caves and jungles of Hindustan, there's a character named Gulab Lal Singh. And within the Theosophical corpus, he has been identified as Moria. Now, Gulab Lal Singh, Moria, is described as a tall Rajput and a Thakur, a feudal chieftain of a Raj. Now, this information occurs in an account that also describes how Gulab Lal Singh kills a tiger with a word. He uses some kind of a mantra or some kind of a spell. The traveling party is attacked by a tiger, and the tiger is killed by this. And later they see his dead body and so forth. Now, as a historian, I would say that's not very likely. But what Johnson does is he also believes that that is not very likely, but at the same time he credits the idea that maybe Moria is in some way a political leader. Now, later this information is used to identify Ranbir Singh, who you see depicted here, the Maharaja of Kashmir, as Moria. You see there's a match there. They're both political leaders. I'm simplifying a bit, of course, but I hope the example makes sense. Now, finally, this information about the Maharaja, he finds information about the Maharaja, there's historical sources about him, there's biographies of him, scholarly ones. So he uses this information and he compares it with what Blavatsky and Occult say, and he arrives at kind of a composite picture. Now, this line of inference, it's based on nothing, ultimately, because we have a very problematic account. We have no way of knowing what is true in that account, because we don't have independent testimony of it. And then we start looking at different phenomena that seem similar. Yeah, that doesn't work. So then, in the end, I think Johnson falls into the trap of creating a lot of speculation, which is very sophisticated, and it's not coming from a bad place. He's genuinely trying to find the truth. But there's a danger here, which is that you fool yourself by these kind of inferences. There's other problems, however. It doesn't just end with the supernatural elements. So we rarely possess more than one account of a meeting with the masters. These were tended to be private meetings. They were very short. They were granted to the chosen few. We rarely have, I would say we actually never have an account where several people who have no stake in the matter witness a meeting with the master. And that brings me to my second point, which is that all these accounts emerge from a small circle of committed theosophists who already believe this to be true, and who are therefore, from a scholarly perspective, possibly not the most reliable witnesses. So what this means is that we can rarely meet the criterion of notable attestation. We rarely have several independent accounts of an event that we can kind of triangulate and figure out what truly happened. It's basically, there's about 62 accounts, and basically they're all unconnected. You see, if we can't verify any one of them, there's no cumulative evidence. It's just 62 unverifiable accounts. There's another problem, which is that contact with the masters is a way of claiming authority. And this becomes very clear when you consider the succession disputes that raged in the Theosophical Society, and also outside of it in the larger Theosophical movement, if you will. All these people, and Brett Forey described this beautifully in his book, Troubled Emissaries, were claiming to be in contact with the masters. So this goes towards ulterior motive, you see. Why would somebody lie about meeting a master? Well, they would lie because it confers authority on you. And one place where this is very clear is in an article that A.P. Sinnett published in Light, the journal that Leslie just mentioned. It's called The Brothers, and he very explicitly there argues that ultimately the authority of theosophy derives from the masters. Now he's doing this in 1883, so his audience knows the occult world has already been published in 1881. His audience knows that he is in contact with these masters, and then you start arguing the ultimate authority of theosophy is derived from these masters. So this confers upon Sinnett. Summing up, three major issues confront any historian when faced with testimony of the masters: the interweaving of the natural and the supernatural, the lack of independent testimony, and the presence of authority claims suggesting possible ulterior motives. Therefore, the evidence is weak, difficult to navigate, and open to interpretation. So, I don't want to stop there. I want to offer a solution to this, and that involves starting to look at this differently. And what I want to do is say, well, you know, this testimony is very problematic. Let's bracket it for the moment. And let's turn to a very concrete piece of evidence that we do possess, which is the Mahatma letters. The Mahatmas are first and foremost the authors of the letters attributed to them. The Mahatma letters contain a wealth of information about their authors beneath the surface. You see, there's also many supernatural elements in the Mahatma letters, but when we look at how these elements are spoken of, what sort of language is used, how they are being treated, we can nonetheless know something about the people who wrote those texts. We can unearth some of this information by employing a philological method, and I will say something about that in a moment. Subsequently, this information can be used to evaluate testimony about the masters. So, Wim, the president of the Theosophical Society in the Netherlands, he sent me a very good review by Charles Ryan.
Where was it published?
I'm not sure. Let me get back to you on that. It's a review of the book by the Hare brothers, who wrote the Mahatma letters. And what Charles Ryan says is, to the question on the title page of this book, who wrote the Mahatma letters, the answer is simply the Mahatmas. Now, I agree, but I attach no a priori meaning to the word Mahatma. I mean, I assume that they are human beings, and that they spoke English and so forth, but I don't bring the testimony into this. Let's first look at what the letters tell us about the Mahatmas, about the people who wrote them. And I'm open to the possibility that Mahatma might mean H.P. Blavatsky. I don't want to exclude that possibility at the start of my research. Now, I don't think it was H.P. Blavatsky, and I will say something about that now. These are some of the books that inspire me. These are books that deal with methodological hermeneutics of philology. Now, I won't say too much about it because I think it would take too much time, but just for people who happen to know them. Now, who wrote the Mahatma letters? You see, if it was H.P. Blavatsky, we of course have loads of independent testimony because Blavatsky was a celebrity, a very important figure in the late 19th century. So I do think it's important to establish, at least provisionally, whether she wrote them or not. So here is where I critically engage with Jocelyn Godwin's article. Godwin writes that the Hare brothers proved the linguistic and cultural kinship between the Mahatma's writings and Blavatsky's own. So he's leaning towards the idea that Blavatsky indeed wrote the Mahatma letters, and he's citing the Hare brothers as proof of that. Now, personally, I don't think the Hare brothers wrote a reliable book. I read the critique of their book by Beatrice Hastings in defense of H.P. Blavatsky. I read the review by Charles Ryan that I just mentioned. Jean Overton Fuller also critiqued what the Hare brothers did, and they found many factual errors in their book. They often take passages completely out of context, and I think the Hare brothers basically had their conclusion ready beforehand. It was dictated by the Hodgson report, and they already knew in their minds that Blavatsky did it, and they looked for evidence that would prove that. So I wouldn't cite the Hare brothers in this case. Now, as James Santucci just mentioned, Vernon Harrison examined the letters and concluded that all the Kutumi letters are written by the same person, and that person is not Blavatsky. So think about that. Like, even if she dictated them, she would have had the same person there every time to write it out. Now, how likely is it? There's not many companions that accompanied Blavatsky throughout all these years. There's not a lot of them at all because she was traveling, you know? So Godwin, he kind of knows this. He knows what Harrison wrote, and his solution is to say, well, maybe Blavatsky suffered from a dissociative identity disorder. Maybe the letters were written in an altered state. Although I praise Godwin for really trying to engage with these questions, I don't think this is a solution in any way, because I happen to have studied psychology, and my professor in psychopathology told me that this idea of dissociative identity disorder, what was used to be known as multiple identity disorder, it's basically been debunked by modern psychology. So it's not really something that I think explains anything, and I don't think it explains anything in a historical paper at the very least, because it's just too controversial. So my suggestion is, first things first, let's redo the work that the Hare brothers did. I mean, they had the right idea. They were looking beneath the surface, but they were looking with preconceived ideas, and that made their work pretty much worthless. So let's redo that, and let's do it in a proper way. So this is my proposal. Testimony about the masters is difficult to navigate. To reduce the masters to myth is to ignore their claimed historical reality. It's to bypass what is actually in the text, which is not that they were metaphysical beings, but they were physical beings. The Mahatma letters are the most concrete evidence we possess. There's so many pages of it. We can learn a lot from them about who wrote them. These letters tell us something about the authors. It does not matter whether they contain fact or fiction. You could write a novel, and if somebody else knows how to look, they can discover a lot about who you are as a person. Handwriting evidence suggests that H.P. Blavatsky is not the author of these letters. And I also don't think it's likely that she dictated it to someone, because I don't know who that someone would be. So my suggestion is, before we return to the historical testimony, the first step is to create a psychocultural profile of the masters by applying a philological method to their letters. Once we have an idea of who the masters are, we can re-engage with the testimony, which at this point is just too difficult to really find clear answers in. But maybe when we have this independent testimony that we are generating, we can do a better job. Thank you very much.